and welcome to Uncommon Sense from FinCrimeTV. Today my guest is Julie Saslow Schroeder. She's a doctor of jurisprudence, a civil litigator who left the courts and entered industry as a lawyer in the tech sector, where she's held a succession of general counsel positions with whatever is the title currently used for the most senior of jobs of that ilk. She has worked in startups and multinationals. She has a particular interest in privacy laws and in big data, but unlike many lawyers, she has a strong commercial attitude, making her a formidable negotiator. She's also a strong advocate for machine learning. Julie Saslow Schroeder, welcome to Uncommon Sense. That's a strong mix. Do you miss the cut and thrust of litigation, or do you find the same excitement in commercial work?
The thing about litigation that I loved is that any case that you're taking on, you're learning something new. The thing about litigation that I didn't love is that you're always antagonistic. You're always trying to tear something down. You're always being a contrarian. And as much as I like a good debate, I didn't feel like that's what I wanted to spend my life doing. I'd rather build things. So general counsel, or I think you very aptly said whatever the equivalent of that is in the United States these days, I'm not entirely sure myself, was the largest category of things that I knew of as an attorney, where you can go practice law, but play with a lot of different areas, which is how I started to learn technology. My first general counsel job was in 2007 in a digital health IT SaaS startup with natural language processing, with a human in the loop, and with sentiment analysis. And that was back when people thought AI was robots and SaaS was an attitude. So it's a little bit ahead of the time.
Indeed. So let's get on to why we're really having this chat. No, we're really having a chat because I'm having a chat with you. But aside from that, your interest in privacy and in big data might seem to collide. The entire purpose of big data is to demand to know everything about someone and to promise that the information will only be used for good. But when we see the terms and conditions that data companies impose, the one thing that stands out as absent is privacy. Have in mind, for example, the biggest data companies of all, such as Google and Facebook or Meta. And in the latter case, that's a company that actively lies about what it does with the data it collects. Ignoring for a moment data security, how do you balance the collection of everything with the individual's desire and sometimes need for privacy?
The way I would say it very quickly is that you do it ethically. When I started, we used libraries that we had the right open source software licenses to use expansively to modify and to commercialize. And then we added data, but our contracts, our clauses, our terms of use all said exactly how we're going to use the data. In this case, it was PHI, personal health information. So it's some of the most secure data or most highly regulated data that you'll find. But we're using natural language processing, right? So natural language processing requires big data. Let's start there. If you source your big data sets ethically, then what you're doing, and you let people know what you're collecting. So I called it a smart algorithm, since people didn't really understand what natural language processing or other AI tools did. And that algorithm is trained on data that you ethically own, that the people have consented to, that actually met all of the GDPR requirements of today, as well as the regulatory framework coming up. And you do it enough times, it takes time to train the models to do what you need. And you also, when you do it this way, it's an open source model as opposed to a closed source model. And by that, I mean ChatGPT and a lot of the models that you're seeing now that have very funky results and have scraped the internet. You have no idea what's in those data sets. You can't find out what's in those data sets. You don't know what their sources were. So the outcome is, in my mind, up in the air. And I like being able to think it through this way. The right big data building the right or using the right LLMs in the way that they were intended to be used, when people are following the rules of the road, they're getting acknowledgement, consent, access, ownership rights, whatever it is that we need. You're building your model, you can test it, and in the pre-training, you can look at things like bias, you can look at things like outcomes, and you're able to make certain tweaks depending on your kind of model. There's different ways to do it. So that is what brings us to where we are today. The problem that we're finding, and I'm going to use Meta today, Facebook of old, because they came out today and said that they used all 1.1 billion images that were publicly available on its website from all of its users. I wasn't a big fan of Facebook, but I had a really good friend, and he used to publish on it back, 20 years ago when it was starting. The only way you could look at it was to be a member. So I signed up. I never used it a lot. I didn't use it extensively, and I made sure to take all the geolocators off of any picture that I put on, and I marked pictures private, particularly of my minor child. I bet you know where I'm going here. I don't think, in fact, I'd bet on it that Meta used data tagging or the correct parsing when it collected its 1.1 billion images to very quickly build up a model, and made sure that it didn't take my private photos or photos of my minor child or yours. That's where we have problems.
So it comes down to whether or not the companies, and I have an immense distaste for Meta, Facebook Meta, and its and all its associated things, including WhatsApp, which I think is one of the most dangerous applications from a spyware point of view that you can put on your phone. But it always has been, even since before Facebook owned it. If personal information were money, and it would be in a bank, and banks are subject to many and varied restrictions, including data security, and that's appropriate given that money is now data and accounts recording money on our record of somebody's life. Do you think that data protection such as GDPR, that's the European Union's data protection regulation, and its clones around the world go far enough? Or should data companies treat data as if they were banks with all the restrictions and protections that entails?
That's a really great question. Let me go back a little bit to answer it. Banks started coming to heel when the SEC imposed very large fines on not meeting the requirements of transparency, of security, so that the financial systems could be secure, because that is very important. I'm not sure that the same will happen unless everyone, so it can't just be the EU, it's got to be the United States, it's got to be everyone in lockstep, having the same requirements or very similar ones, perhaps more restrictive in some places would be fine, but also has a very big stick to go with it. And I think that's what's lacking right now. So the FTC has promulgated some new rules where there's financial information, which pretty much touches big data everywhere. They're great, but there's no big stick. The SEC, I hear, is coming out with something. I expect that if there's going to be financial penalties, we might find them there. But the GDPR often lacks the same enforceability that HIPAA, high tech, the California Consumers Protection Act, the CCPA, state or national, in the case of the United States, regulations do. And until it's not profitable to continue to run roughshod off of people's rights and collect data, be slapped by fines that for these companies are, like 5 minutes of profitability, I don't think we're going to see a change.
Is it also that we're not going to see a change because companies, and American companies are amongst the worst at this, no matter where they operate in the world, bury in the middle of some immense terms and conditions a line that says, we own the data that you upload to our system. And it also includes another line that says, we can do anything we like with that data. And those things cannot be contracted out of. There's no opt-out for that.
No, well, there has to be, like, the United States is requiring an opt-out, just like the GDPR, and that's what Article 17, I think, requires an opt-out for all the things that Article 6 categories process.
But
You
it doesn't
need,
work.
right? I mean, that's the issue, and again, that's why I think that unless you have a big, financial stick to go with it. And to be hyperbolic, let's compare it. Philip Morris for decades knew that, nicotine was addictive. They knew that it caused cancer. They bribed the Surgeon General into issuing a report in 1965 that it was perfectly safe. They didn't want any regulation of the tobacco industry. They moved all of their facilities offshore so they weren't discoverable in the United States, because this is back before the time that we had computers to be able to do that. And they made them more addictive and more cancerous while saying the exact opposite. It wasn't until Philip Morris got hit with punitive damage case after punitive damage case and hundreds of millions of fines per case that anything happened. Or let's take the Ford Pinto gas tank. Let's take a 1970s example. The Ford Pinto gas tank, and what I think people are doing, I've mentioned this in some posts, is a cost-benefit analysis, right? The benefit is billions of dollars. The cost is a couple million of dollars. Are we going to relocate the gas tank when we know that in 1,000 cases, it's likely if it gets hit a certain way that 10 people are going to die? No, because the cost for them outweighs the benefit. I don't think people work on ethics for the most part, who are in charge of making these decisions. So
then, if that's the case, and I know this is slightly off topic, but should we then be looking at the CEOs of large organizations and saying, your company, your responsibility, and putting them in jail where there are the data breaches? And I'm not talking about where the company is hacked. That's a separate problem. Not that kind of data breach, but the kind of data breach for its own benefits.
So let's do hacking and personal responsibility. So personal responsibility, I think if you are intentionally aware that you are violating the laws, that you are able to have personal responsibility for your actions in any company, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I'm aware. Let me give you an example. Let me give you one example. And I'm going to tie it to your hacking one. In SolarWinds, one of the biggest cyber hacking cases of the time, the C-suite and the board were aware of the fact that there were vulnerabilities that they failed to correct. And so the courts made them personally responsible. Their D&O policies weren't near enough to cover that. And, that is one thing. Let's go to OpenAI. In the case where you're supposed to be a non-for-profit company that's supposed to be working for the benefit of humankind, yet you're doing the exact opposite. And it's not that you're doing it, stealthily. Your board is actually announcing it in memos that are reported on and verified by several news sources. If you act against your bylaws and you're not following your charter, you are personally responsible. So that is one way to go.
So why do we not see the bosses of Google and Meta in court?
That's a question for the Attorney General.
And it's to do with with,
of
with
each state, and
let's
perhaps
let's call it corruption light, where there's not necessarily money changing hands, although we all know the political donations that go on. But there are, without doubt, influences. I mean, we've seen a number of examples of those same two companies. When the UK has tried to do something about them, they have basically gone to the UK government and said, "Look, we're really big and you're not, so we're going to do what we like." And the UK government has basically said, "Yeah, okay then."
So that is what I call the Uber model. Uber, when it started out, they wanted to extend their reach beyond big cities in the United States to smaller places in the United States, but particularly globally. They bribed regulators. They are on recorded calls with the CEO saying, yeah, quote unquote, excuse my French, because this is going to be a bad word, we're hella fucking illegal. It was a culture. And it's a culture of steamrolling until you make enough money or you go bankrupt. That's rolling the dice. I think that's reckless.
Absolutely.
But it's something that is done. And Airbnb did it as well. And they ended up, still prospering. So
there is a weakness in governments across the world where they simply will not say, "We have determined that you are a criminal organization and we're not going to allow you to operate in our country." There are
you can't pass gun control in the United States.
But the companies are so close to meeting the definition of organized crime groups.
Yep.
It is astonishing that nobody is willing to breach that membrane and say, you are deliberately committing crime and therefore you are banned from our country.
I have a little more faith that if, some of the time, I've been doing this for 20 years. Some of the problem is that the regulators or the people in charge of making the regulations, people in charge of enforcing them, see things as a one-off. It's a privacy problem. It's a security problem. It's a data problem. It's, they just had a bad LLM. They had a bad model for their AI tool. They don't realize how interconnected all of these things are. But I think we're reaching some kind of critical mass where they are going to finally, wake up and smell the coffee and realize that these things are interrelated. And I think they're working on it really hard right now.
You might say that, but within the last week, we've seen the UK government enter into some rather facile agreement, I have to say, with a large number of IT companies over attempts to prevent online fraud. And yet yesterday, Meta announced that it is going to end-to-end encrypt Facebook messaging, which the National Crime Agency in the UK has become apoplectic about, saying we get 800 criminals, 800 child molesters a month out of the investigations that we are able to do through, amongst others, Facebook messaging. And we are not going to be able to get those people. Now Facebook messaging has gone to what is in essence a Telegram model.
Right. It's a false flag.
Sorry?
It's a false flag. They're whipped over, failing to be secure. And so they encrypted the easiest thing that they could encrypt, kind of as a big, FU to people trying to regulate them, because they're not thinking through the consequences. They're not thinking through the repercussions, or they don't care. I don't know if it's one or all of the above.
I think it's simpler than that. I think it's that Facebook has decided it wants to take out Telegram. Facebook has an objective of world domination. It didn't manage to take out Skype, and it now sees Telegram and probably Signal as its primary competitors in this marketplace, and I think it is commercial. I don't think the consequences are of any relevance The idea is simply there's a market, there's a lot of people using it, we want it.
Which is ironic, because Signal is actually a bona fide encryption method for professionals who really have to be careful about transmitting data, whether they're in the security industry or the legal industry. It's an excellent example of a tool that can be used in order to make messages safer.
It can, but I have to say that I don't like Signal, because when it's on my phone, it wants access to data that I don't want it to have.
Yeah, I look at my settings all the time to make sure that that doesn't happen. I don't want a lot of interplay, and that brings us to IoT, right? Everything that touches the internet plays off of something else or tries to. And if you don't understand what in your phone, just using your phone, is feeding your contact information, for example, to other things in your phone, that's a problem. That is a security and a privacy problem.
That's at the heart of my primary objection with Facebook, with WhatsApp, because it will not work properly if I don't give it access to all my contacts list. But I don't want it to know who my clients are.
Yeah. And it's difficult because your alternatives are a video call or a very, very expensive telephone call, because it's, most international calls are made on WhatsApp because it's free and you can use the same phone number so people can keep track of who you are. Skype has actually lost so much of its market power because of that, because it made it easier. But, there's a little bit of a devil in that bargain. You're right.
We originally came across each other in relation to so-called artificial intelligence and machine learning. You're a fan and I'm, well, not. In fact, I deny there's any such thing, and that's well documented elsewhere. I just see algorithms and instructions, and I see absolutely no magic in the computing sense, even though the end results may seem magical, especially in images. There's no doubt that they can be absolutely beautiful or beyond foul. We both want to see the technology used appropriately, and one of the things you're paying special attention to is the intellectual property aspects of large collections of data obtained by bots and then reused without the permission of the copyright owners. Before you tell us about one of the legal cases that's developing, I have a more fundamental question. Are we now reaping the results of a lack of foresight in how the World Wide Web works, with open access to data being part of the DNA of the web, and a widely held misunderstanding of what in the public domain actually means?
Oh, I don't think there's any misunderstanding. I just don't think, like I said, I think they've done a cost benefit analysis and decided it's worth it. I don't think
I'm talking in a more general sense, where if somebody reads something on the internet, and I know that the American Digital Millennium, whatever it's called, Act, actually protects people who want to steal copyright material. It's bizarre, but there is a specific provision that protects theft of copyright.
That's called fair use. But to be clear about, let's take copyright, since you brought it up, and it's also the thing that's most commonly used, but I'll just say not the biggest IP infringement problem that companies are going to have. It's low-hanging fruit. So the right is rooted in the American Constitution and then has been promulgated through the USPTO. And the case law has been clear since time immemorial that the author of a work owns the work and all of its derivatives. And it doesn't matter how they come to you. You can't say, oh, it's not my fault, Bob gave me this, or I got it from my OpenAI ChatGPT model. You're on the hook for infringement. And the chief infringement case,
which specifically says you cannot be held responsible for republishing something which you find on the internet. And so what that means is that everybody, you see it on YouTube all the time, people have put the bottom up under the stolen material, but I do not own this. It is put here just for fair use or for educational purposes.
So that's the fair use exception. And whether or not you buy into the fair use exception, it doesn't apply here anyway. So we don't need to talk about it. The courts have ruled repeatedly that this isn't by no means a fair use.
No, I agree. That is not. But I'm saying that when you're saying it's low-hanging fruit, my argument to that is the tree is broadest at the base, and so it is the most people are trying to make use of that provision. Whereas the higher you go up the tree, the less fruit there is. That's why it's more difficult to get. But there's less people trying to pick it, and less people. There's less. The harms may be bigger, but the volume of harm is less.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, the logic behind the fair use policy was to acknowledge the internet and a certain amount of people cutting and pasting a certain amount of text that had already been put out in the public domain. But
well, there's the problem. In the public domain, in the sense that it means accessible to the public, is not the same as being legally in the public, as legal domain from a legal point of view. I may make something so that everybody in the world can read it, but I have not made it available on the open commons or whatever, which is technically a license.
Right.
So
although it's not a very good one to use.
No, it's not. But you're kind of stuck with it half the time. But if somebody goes to one of my websites and copies the material on it, and directly or through some thin rewrite puts it on their website and gets 10, 20, 30 times more visits than I get on mine, that's not right. And yet it happens.
It's really, I understand being utterly gobsmacked by that, because it isn't right. But on the other hand, you have to balance the reality of what's going on versus the harm. So they drew a line. I'm not saying it's correct, where they have legally defined the public domain and they allow you to do so much. I still quote all of my source material in my posts anyway, because
it's the fair thing to do.
It's the right thing.
That's only one of the two things that the Act does. The making things available for academic research or for fair use or whatever. That's one thing. But the second thing, where there is much, much more concern, which is how it specifically provides a mechanism by which fake news can be redisseminated without consequence. So it says, if you read something on the internet and you republish it, you are not liable for that republication. And I have enormous trouble with that.
It doesn't say if you see something and you know it's not correct and republish it, that you're not liable. If you knowingly are publishing incorrect information, you're not hitting this regulation, but you are hitting others where you would be liable. But getting to disinformation, that is a real problem.
So if we look at that, we then go on to the reason that we originally arranged this chat. Given that machines don't think, machines are not cognizant, machines are not, they are not aware. How can a machine that trawls the internet, collects information, data of whatever form, and then builds that into something like ChatGPT results, where would the liability for that for falsehoods in that end product?
That's a really good question. I can see some ways that it can happen, but let's just start with, you're scraping the internet. We're going to take generative AI as your example, because that's what all the hubbub is about lately.
Yeah, I still can't bring myself to call it.
There's two different kinds, and we should start with that. There's predictive, and there's generative. Predictive is based on, a lot of more sophisticated math than generative AI is the statistical probability of the correlation of things that it has seen many, many times before. And so its p-value or ratio, is usually very high, which is bad. It means that you tend to get the incorrect things, because if you feed it enough, tweets from Trump, and that's all it's working on, that's what it's going to see the world is. Not only that, but what people don't realize is that it's limited by what's called a parametric date, which is the date the last training information went into a model. So ChatGPT-4, I'm a little confused because they say that the parametric date is April, yet their terms of use say it's January. They can't seem to get that right either. But either way, if you ask it right now, what is Sandra Day O'Connor doing? It's not going to know she's dead. So they have a lot of limitations. And I don't mind that so much, because if you know what's in the data and your goal for your particular AI tool, in this case in generative AI, is for administrative tasks, that doesn't really matter. If it's for, linking up things so that they can be calendared correctly, it doesn't matter. If it's for nuanced items that require some human thought, that's where we get into trouble. That's where we get the United case. Let's talk about that as your example of the perfect storm of all these things coming together. United was using generative AI to try and see when people should not be allowed to have any more rehab benefits. Their models were atrocious. They were warned that their models were highly inaccurate. They spit out information that the humans who were supposed to implement the model said, whoa, this does not look right. And yet they forged on, ignored that, and went with what the models told them. That's where you're going to see some very, very big liability. And there's no way of getting around it, because that's willful blindness. It's beyond negligence. It's intentional at that point.
I've recently used an example in a paper that I produced for a conference of Formula One, where the cars are absolutely laden with sensors, and seemingly the most unreliable part of the car is the sensors. So the sensors send back reports which are in many cases inaccurate or wrong, and then a human engineer and or the driver says, I don't believe it, carry on. And if they relied entirely on what the sensors are telling them, then the cars would spend half the race in the garage with teams of people looking for problems that don't actually exist. So
that's the human in the loop component to a lot of what I've worked with. Yep.
I often say that the problem with all so-called artificial intelligence is that it should not be allowed out to play without adult supervision.
That's defining human in the loop for AI models. Yep.
Yeah,
I agree. It's the ones that I've gravitated towards as well. And it doesn't have to be natural language processing or generative AI. You can co-parent, which is use a variety of systems like neurosymbolic AI tends to do that. And they balance out each other's deficiencies, but they still have some aspect of a person looking it over to say, is this weird? And that's important, because you're right. Computers aren't sentient. They cannot think. So they're doing mathematical calculations in order to give you the answer that it thinks based on what data it has at the time is correct. And that's not something that you want to use to make a clinical diagnosis of a patient.
No, absolutely.
That's where the error rate or hallucinations come into play. So, and that's also the p-value or p-ratio, depending on what side of the pond you're on. So when I think about it, and I'm looking at the data and the data quality and the data source, I'm also looking at the goal of what I'm asking the AI tool to do with that. Because when it can harm people, if something is missed, or where it can harm people because people, it is not being reviewed by a human in any way, that's troubling. And I am a fan of AI. I am a fan of these methods of study. I love the way that it works. But let me give you an example. When you sometimes, well, I'll use a natural language processing. So this is a predictive model based on actual, source data that I knew what it was. And it was coding medical concepts. So there was like the neck of the thigh bone. Sometimes it would weight the neck and the thigh incorrectly. And even though you're talking about the thigh, it would read it as the neck. And what would come back made absolutely no sense to human beings who were looking at it. And they were like, this technology is crap. And this was back in the day that J.K. Rowling was writing Harry Potter. And since people didn't know what hallucinations or error rates were, we called them howlers. Like, it's just, every once in a while, a machine is going to make a mistake where you look at it and you have no bloody idea how that even happened. But it's not going to be a way that makes sense to humans, because human thought is not the basis of its, coming to that conclusion. We obviously take more nuance, sophistication, and context into play when we make decisions. And that's the crux of it.
And in my field, we are seeing a large number of companies that have, not to put too fine a point on it, run out of money because venture capital has realized that artificial intelligence is not the solution to identifying suspicious transactions and the like, and that it's the background data and the algorithms are very, very complicated and very, very expensive. So companies have been running out of money. They've been trying to raise more money from venture capital. That money is not forthcoming. And so they've jumped on the latest bandwagon, which is generative AI. And they're saying, this is the way that we're going to solve the problems that we've already been paid to solve and failed at. What I'm concerned with here is that the more we look at large language models, the more we look at game theory, the more we look at the statistical models that these things are based upon, all of that is absolutely irrelevant, because it all comes down to one guy in a dark room writing an algorithm. And if he doesn't understand what that algorithm is required to do in all the myriad things that feed into it, it is going to be wrong, or the results are going to be wrong.
That's why I keep going back to the holistic approach. Like, that's why in any company that I start with dev. I sit down and ask them, give me the model, give me the use case. What did you build it with? What was the pre-training like? What are the error rates? And have you thought about the fact that while you're using it for X task, it's going to be used for Y task and Z task later? I don't think these are acceptable. Like, you need people who understand security, privacy, intellectual property, technology, how AI tools and models work, big data sets, and what the difference between good ones and bad ones are. Obviously, if you're scraping the entire internet, there's a lot of crap out there. And like, people know that intuitively. They're just not thinking it through, because it's a bad time in the economy. People who are laid off, it's a hard time to raise money because it turned into more of a bear market. And this is in and of itself the latest hype. But it's the latest hype because people have just found out about it for the most part this year. Whereas those of us who've been working with it for decades, and I'm not a data scientist. I come at it from the risk management perspective. So I feel like I am required to know all of these things in order to do a good job so that the company is protected, the revenue is protected, the value is protected, and the reputation is protected. Theirs and mine.
So that's from a compliance and a company risk point of view. But I'm focused on a different part of that for much the same reasons, I have to say. I mean, it's fascinating that you and I are approaching this from almost diametrically opposed positions.
I'm doing it to you on purpose.
No. It's our starting points are different. Yeah. And yet we're looking, and yet even though we may express our concerns in different ways, they are the same concerns.
Yep.
And my concern is, as you said, what's going to happen to the lives and livelihoods of people where the wrong results are produced? Well, if a result comes out saying this person is pretty much a criminal, therefore the report is to be made to the authorities, and the authorities, because they have a complementary computer system, say, okay, let's issue a prosecution, and then we'll sort it out in court. Someone's life is already destroyed. So yes. by not interposing human reactions at each of those stages, which is the direction that we're taking, and we know that properly run companies are saying, hang on a minute, we're not going to take that result out of that suspicious we're not going to take as read that conduct is suspicious. We're going to get a human to look at it. But the tendency is that now the humans that are looking at it are less and less experienced, less and less knowledgeable. We are seeing an exodus of the most senior people from within financial institutions as more and more of the tech is being imposed on them. And they're quite often saying, this doesn't work, so you've got a choice. It's me or the tech. And the humans are losing.
Well, look, go back to 2008 if you want to do that. And before, the years before that, leading up to 2008, the mortgage derivative algorithms that were being used did not balance on a ledger sheet, did not make any sense. But a lot of people were making a lot of money, so they went with it. The smart investment banks and the really smart people who look at things from all sides came in and said, wait a second, I'm not comfortable with this. We need a complete and comprehensive review. I think the entire economy would have collapsed worldwide. It was bad enough, but if that hadn't happened, if some of those places hadn't done it, so you have to be careful about the we. But and there's different harms, right? There's when you're affecting people. In this case, people's lost their houses. People don't have access to the medical care they can have. That's if you're lucky. If you're talking about identifying someone who you think was a criminal, good God. I mean, psychological studies of humans have time and time again shown that our internal perception colors what we see in order to make an identification of someone who might have perpetrated a crime. Take that out of it and put it into just an algorithm, and the same ethnic groups are going to keep coming up over and over again. It's not because they commit more crime. It's because the internet tends to sensationalize those cases over others. There was a time, maybe I'm a little bit too statistically biased, but there was a time when I was with someone in the 1990s. We were walking back from a party, and there was a bunch of African-American gentlemen on the street, and they wanted to cross the street because they were worried about getting assaulted. And I said, I'm sorry, like, you do know that 99% of rapists are white men, right? Like, we're better off on this side of the street than we are on anywhere else. But people don't tend to think that way. I can't explain the why of that. That would be a great psychological meets technical study, but
a lot of that is in my book, Understanding Suspicion in Financial Crime. So I'm not going to put all 600 pages of that in this conversation. Or is it
I
still
will say one other thing.
sorry,
If you doubt,
324 pages, something like that.
if you doubt,
The marketing of the book says something like 335,000 words or 600,000 words or something, not one of them wasted.
nice. If
Um,
you doubt the error rates of generative, the hallucination rates of generative AI are much, much higher. And also, there is a tendency, I don't think people realize that the more information that goes into an LLM, there becomes a tipping point where it becomes fractured and broken and more incorrect than it was before. I also don't think that people realize that you can't just take out the bad part and excise it and keep going. You have to retrain the entire model on all of the data. So if you don't believe there's bias, just type in a prompt, a Muslim walks into a bar, and see what ChatGPT tells you. Then try the white lady.
I did an experiment recently with generative AI, as it is called. I really don't like that phrase. As looking at how it treats one phrase. I used 6 or 7 different models, and I put the same instruction set into each of them. Half of them were completely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they didn't produce what the image that should have been produced at all, and the other half produced wildly different results.
Yep.
So here we have a problem. We know that, in fact, of those engines, several of them fall back onto the same base data, and yet even those manage to produce different results. So here's, again, I have this big problem. If we cannot, even where the question is identical, if the models produce vastly different results, how can we rely on it in an important situation like medicine or law or defining suspicion? And secondly, how do we train the people to ask the right questions? If you've got 10, 20, 30,000 people working in multiple languages across the whole world, but using the same essential data set to be able to identify suspicious transactions, then how are you going to make those people asking different questions, different dialects, to ask the question that is going to produce the result you want? And equally importantly, if you're telling the machine, you're telling the people, ask the question in this way so we get the result we want, are you not prejudging the machine? And should you not, in that case, be trying to use it and declare that it has some sort of independent integrity?
Okay. I'm going to just caveat that one with it's 10 o'clock at night where I live. I have not eaten. You just asked me 5 questions in a row, but I'm going to try to hit it as best I can.
Sorry.
First is that you get different results from different generative AI models because they have different data in their data sets. The closed systems you don't know. The open source systems you can know, which is why transparency is so important to be able to rely on whatever result you're getting. You still have to know that it could be wrong because you're never going to eliminate error rates, but you can make them more acceptable. So, I think that gets down to when you approach it that way, the quality of the data, again, is essential. The way that you're using that data is just as essential. And if you are using that data for disinformation, yeah, I got no argument for that one. I mean, it's not that hard.
So one last question then, seeing as it's 10 o'clock and this chat is supposed to last 15 minutes and it patently has not. The one last question is, I forgot what the one last question was. I'm going to have to edit this out now while I try to remember what the question was.
You were asking if you can rely on the people to make decisions. And I think if the people understand these basic principles of how things work, then you can, like, if there was some kind of certification and generative AI tools, Not that that's great, because that's just theoretical and you have no practical experience. And in my mind, practical experience solving these problems wins the day every time. But I think if people had a better understanding of how they worked, they'd be less inclined to either gain them or, rely on results that don't really feel right, but the computer told me it was, so it must be okay. I'll tell you, when the Chat GPT model came out almost exactly a year ago, I was at a dinner, executive dinner, and I was sitting across from the CTO, who doesn't have a lot. He was brilliant and a really nice guy. He knew his data, but he didn't have a lot of AI ML experience. And they all thought it was so cool. And I said, you understand that what they're doing is, building basically a turbocharged ramp to an LLM model with everything that you guys are entering into this. I didn't really think they'd go and scrape and use bots and crawl and any method that you can to get data off of hundreds of millions of websites. I thought they were using this data, which was a huge amount of data to begin with, but I wasn't, even though I love these tools, I've never picked it up, because I knew that I would be training something that is less than optimal, and that they were going to commercialize it.
If we flick back to what we were saying earlier about the terms and conditions of, for example, Google, we now have Google Cloud, which is which is being used as the marketing name for one of its artificial intelligence, in inverted commas, projects. And here's where what you've just said goes back very neatly to what we said earlier, which is, if Google claims that it owns all the data which is in all of its services, including what you upload to your Google Cloud, then Google can be using that material to train its own models.
Right.
I think
this is something I was actually noodling on today, and I have half of the post written, but I'll give you a teaser, since you're you and I like you very much. So when I signed up for Google, those weren't the terms and conditions, because I'm the kind of person who read the data disclosure from 23andMe. And they were at least transparent in the myriad of ways that they were just going to use my genetic information. And I could see that playing out later to pre-auths for insurance. I mean, there's just hundreds of ramifications. I keep it in the other room to remind myself that knowing that is important. When I signed up, those weren't the terms and conditions. So let me ask you a question. Can you retroactively pose terms and conditions on minors, dead people, people who did not agree to them when they were using it, at the time, and use that data?
Other than dead people, no, you can't. I don't think, but they do constantly. All of the companies constantly revise their terms and conditions, and if you want to use it tomorrow, you've got to accept it.
And that would be okay if the data that they were using was from that date forward. But what I'm saying is that did not happen when you take Google into account, or AWS. They were picking up data from your smart devices. They acquired Roomba so they could basically get the interior of your house. I mean, I thought it was really odd at first. Like, why would Amazon want a robot vacuum cleaner? But then I thought about it for about 5 minutes. I'm like, oh shit, that is some serious data collection that people don't realize.
It is nothing except my computers are attached to the internet. I refuse to allow it. The one last question that I have for you, if we're going to, let's go back to our origins as litigators. When somebody is the subject of one of these reports, to what extent do you think it will be possible for that person to require disclosure of the full workings of the model, and of all the background data which was available to that model, plus what background data was selected and why? We could do it in an investigation. Are we going to be able to do it where we're looking at computers?
This is why open source and closed source are so important, because closed source models, usually the only way that you can get into a closed source model and demand that is for some kind of
discovery.
Well, not discovery, no. It's actually it's at the classified information threshold of discovery. An open source model and their studies and pre-training and their error rates, yes, you can absolutely be able to get that. Google's Bard and Chat GPT are closed systems.
We have seen in the UK, in the case of HSBC and Shah, that manual systems were discoverable. Why should there be a difference between a manual system and a computerized storage?
When you sign up to use a closed system, you are agreeing to the fact that you are not going to know how the sausage is made. It's really that simple.
That's fine if you're talking about something like Bard and the like, but when you're talking about a bank which has its own closed system,
right?
The case is established that the bank has that the information is discoverable when it's on paper. So how is that different in that specific case where it's literally like for like? It's on paper or it's in computer form. And it's important to understand that within the Data Protection Act, in the UK, that paper data is protected in exactly the same way as computer data.
Yeah, I like that about the Data Protection Act very much. I also like the auditing very much. My answer is honestly, Nigel, I don't know how this is going to play out in court. God forbid, and when someone is seriously injured, as a result of something that looks a lot like United, but kept going. I don't know how the courts will resolve that.
Well, we've seen a slightly oblique point. We've seen a recommendation from the Law Commission in the UK that says that it proposes that it should be provided that where a computerized car is involved in an accident, that it should not be the human who had control of that car, but it should be the computer, it should be the producers of the computer which had control at that time. So we're now seeing countries going against that and saying specifically, in fact, China has only yesterday or the day before said that all automated vehicles must have a human in control, or must have a human who can turn the thing off or whatever. And so it is saying we will not allow fully automated vehicles. And we know that Teslas have a pretty poor history, and so does several others, but Tesla seems to be the one that's in the media the most. So the idea that the Law Commission had, which is basically to say there's a black box, the humans in control of that black box are not responsible for it, but the designers of the black box are. I kind of like that, but I don't think that it should be entirely possible for the operators of the black box to wash their hands of it. Do you disagree?
I don't disagree. I like that analogy. There isn't a mechanism, at least you have a mechanism in the EU and in the UK in order to get there. As far as I know, what the FTC just promulgated, I don't know what the SEC is going to say. I expect regulations to come shortly. That aspect is not incorporated into the thinking yet. I hope that it is, so that we don't just leave it to judges that will bounce between jurisdictions and cherry pick their jurisdiction and their appellate court.
Julie Saslow Schroeder, thank you very much. It has been way longer than expected. I don't think there's going to be very many edits out of this because it has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. So it could well be the longest on common sense we've ever had. Thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you very, very much, Nigel. I appreciate it. I'll be in touch. Take care.